So, taking the message to Garcia, what does it mean to me? So, when I was a recruit at Paris Island, when you're a recruit, you're bottom of the totem pole. You're basically a piece of shit under all and certain conditions. But a lot of the times, the drill instructors, who were basically, one step below Jesus Christ himself and the hierarchy, they would tell you to go do something. And you don't really have a conversation with a drill instructor. Like, you have to request permission to speak. Then you have to speak in the third person. And a lot of times that was not what they were after. They gave you something to do and they wanted you to just do it and shut up and don't ask any stupid questions, because you're obviously stupid because you're a Marine recruit at Paris Island. I remember one incident where this guy, I think his first name was Dan Zinicola. He was such a bag smasher. He was like, "McCarthy, get in that goddamn gear locker, and I want the whole thing squared away." And this was early on in the adventure. So, squared away. Did he want me to inventory it? Did he want me to restack it? Because I was just in there and I thought it looked amazing. So I started to ask him a question, and there was like an inspection involved. Not by him, by somebody else that was coming in the unit to inspect it. And he grabbed me by the throat. He's like, "Just take the fucking message to Garcia." And I was like, "Okay." And I got in that gear locker and shut the door. And I was like, who the hell is Garcia? And why am I taking him a message? And about 3 minutes later, this other guy named Sergeant Collishaw came in and knocked over all 3 shelves and just completely wrecked my gear locker. And I don't even know if that was choreographed. I think I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I didn't learn what it was yet. But then oftentimes somebody would get tasked with something and they would be told to just take the message to Garcia. Then I started to pick up on, there was rules that everybody knew. And when the drill instructors wanted you to do something and they wanted you to break rules, they would just say, take the message to Garcia. That means, take care of what needs to be done. Hide the bodies. And that is, so one of the things when I'm saying take the message to Garcia, I don't want to know how you do it, because clearly I've been briefed on what we're allowed to do, what we're not allowed to do, and the rules in place don't make it possible, and we've been told to make it possible. So just take the message to Garcia. The other way is kind of the same thing, but not hide the bodies. Is this is not a time for mentorship. This is not a time for you to ask me 16 questions. This is a time for you to just take what I gave you and go away. Let's play a game called Go Away. Just take the message to Garcia. Those are the 2 ways. You're either hiding bodies or, this is not a conversation. Just go take care of this. We don't need to discuss it. It's pretty simple. Now, go away. And so fast forward, I never got the story on who Garcia was. My career went pretty well as a Marine. Eventually it took them 25 years to figure out how to get rid of me. But when I was a aspiring private first class, and Lance Corporal, I was told that, I was going to go to a promotion board and that I needed to be very familiar with the Commandant's reading list. And the first thing on that reading list, at the top of the list, was a message to Garcia. And I'm like, so that's an actual thing? There's an actual message to Garcia? And then I read it and I thought, oh my God, this is one amazing, unbelievably sarcastic diatribe about taking initiative that I believe I will pass on for the rest of my life. And, here we are, 28 years later, and I tell somebody to take the message to Garcia probably every 3 days or so, I would say, 3 days.
You're listening to Let Me Speak to a Manager with Frank Cava and Ian Matthews.
What a crock of shit.
Yeah, that was hot mic, Sam.
You can't say God here.
Don't worry, nobody's listening anyway.
Do it live! I'll write it and we'll do it live!
Frankie!
Ian, you son of a bitch.
Wow, man. We are going to talk about a message to Garcia today.
So the question I would like to ask is, how early is it to tell your kids to take a message to Garcia? Like, my son pissed his pants last night in his crib. Like, can I just hand him this message when I get home?
Max is 2. I would start using the terminology as early as possible. I wouldn't count on it resonating with him
For another 2 decades.
Till he's probably 13 or 14, but I would start using it now, and just in hopes that it comes a little earlier than it did for my kids, the message to Garcia.
Season it. Yes. Plant the seed.
Season. So for our listeners that have no idea what the hell we're talking about, message to Garcia is a essay. It's about a 2.5 page, fantastically sarcastic essay written in 1899 that is prevalent in the military, and also in the corporate world. Corporate executives use this term, and Frank brought it into my world, which was brought to his world by his homie Murph, who is a good friend of his since childhood. So maybe talk about how Murph brought it to you, since I'm a derivative.
So our cold open is our buddy Murph explaining a little bit about what message Garcia meant to him. And Murph, his arc and story, which I think is relevant. He's a natural born leader. He just was. Like, he was one of our team captains in high school football, and he was he wanted to go the military route out of high school. So he enlisted and went to Paris Island, and he was enlisted Marine, which, if you don't know anything about that, like, it's the bottom of the rung. They kind of just bark at you, and you have to kind of survive and figure it out. And he was exposed to a message to Garcia there. And then because he's a leader and he's talented with people, he was moved from an enlisted. They had him go to the Naval Academy, which is no small feat. And then he went back into as an officer. And a message to Garcia is something that he was exposed to probably in 1992, 1993, when he was quite young. And he exposed me to it in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I was managing. And I was frustrated talking about, like, building houses and property and in project managing. And he goes, man, you got to just read a message to Garcia. You got to tell people, just go deliver the message to Garcia. And, like, when I read something from, like, Mark Twain or something that's 120 something years old, I don't get it. Like, it's hard for me to really understand it. Like, I got the general gist, but it's written in a way that's somewhat different. But as I got older, I kind of embraced it. And we'll talk about kind of the arc of the article. But that's how it came to me, is from a lifetime friend who understands the frustrations of managing people and who was in the military. And this was pretty common.
Before we get much further, what is Murph's full real name?
Can I tell a funny story?
What is Murph's name?
So Murph's name is Murph. It's a nickname that came about in college or in high school.
What's his real name?
I'm going to get to it. But his last name is McCarthy. But in high school, what they would do is they would put a piece of tape on your forehead, on the exterior of your helmet, and that would be your name. That's how they knew who you were. It was McCarthy. So McCarthy's on a piece of tape, but Murph led with his head. So his piece of tape got beat up really fast. And by the time the head coach noticed who he was, it didn't say McCarthy anymore. And you would never go ask anyone for another piece of tape. And back then you wouldn't have said, I'm going to get a message to Garcia, get the piece of tape, get the marker and put it on your helmet. You just left it alone in fear of pissing off your high school football coach. So Murph was under the name McCarthy became Murph. in high school. This
because
story
his
gets
coach, when he would see the tape, would see just Murph.
because the rest of it was gone.
Yeah.
But the funniest thing about this story, Ian, is we went to weightlifting, and the coach would go down the roll and just like this was like a summer session. You're supposed to go there, like it's part of school, like you're enrolled in summer school. So he's going to class every single day, and our gym teacher, our coach, didn't actually read anyone's names. He just took the roll. So Murph comes home from school one day, and his dad's like, "What are you doing?" He's like, I had my day, went and worked out. I went and did this, went and did that. And his dad's like, so I'm going to ask you again, what'd you do today? And he goes through the whole thing. I went to school. I weightlifted. He goes, I got this letter here that says you haven't been there for one effing day. What the hell? And he's like, that can't be right. It can't be right. So Murph went in the next day and goes and talks to our head football coach and goes, Coach, you're marking me absent. He goes, what's your name? He's like, McCarthy. He goes, why the hell I've been calling you Murph?
So the beauty of all of this, Frank has never called him by McCarthy. He's Murph when he talks about his friend Murph. I've met Murph multiple times. All I called him was Murph. He goes by Murph by everyone around him. Everyone calls him Murph. That's it. And
if you're in the military
for years after meeting Murph, that his name was Murph.
Everybody knows a Murph, but like if you go anywhere in the military, anything around Annapolis, anything, it's like, oh, I went to high school with Murph. They're like, Murph? Like Murph is like world famous. Like Murph is so funny. One of our friends who went to Michigan mimicked him, was in a bar, and the guy's like, my name's Murph. And they're like, holy crap, we know this other guy who used to mimic you. Like he's world famous.
It's beautiful. So Frank shared this with me in similar fashion. It was he caught me on a bad day where as a manager, I'm grumbling about people just not doing their jobs. And do I have to spoon feed everything and blah, 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 blah. And he said, I'm going to send you something that my boy Murph sent me. And I remember reading it, and it just was written in such a tone that is so smart ass and so sarcastic that I fell in love with it immediately. Because I think it hits at a undertone that many managers feel, which is just, look, I hired you, do your job, quit coming back and asking me questions. So and the funny thing is, I remember when I read it, so this is 10 years ago, I was probably 34 when I read this thing, 35. And I remember thinking, man, some old man must have written this, because it's written like a get off of my lawn type of old dude just grumbling about kids these days. It's hilarious. But I looked it up, and the dude was 43 when he wrote it, which is...
He was an old soul, Ian. He was an old soul.
Younger than both Frank and I, who think we are much younger than we are. But, pretty interesting fact. So Elbert Hubbard is the guy that wrote it. And Hubbard, he was born in 1850 something, and he was a writer, a journalist, did other things. He was in business, but interesting enough, he considered himself an anarchist and a socialist. But after he wrote Message to Garcia, he was mocked by the socialist press. They called him a sellout. And he didn't mean for it to come across that way, but it's a decidedly pro-business memo. And fascinating enough, business articles were written that this was this pro-business champion, Elbert Hubbard, who had been a self-proclaimed anarchist and socialist, who was kicked out of socialist circles. Before he wrote this, he had written at one point that, once what's interesting is he turned on the Socialist Party after this because they all kind of kicked him out. And so he leaned in all on it to where he got to a point where he said things like prison's an example of a socialist paradise where equality prevails, everything is supplied and competition is eliminated. But I don't think he meant for that to happen when he wrote Message to Garcia. It just so happens that every businessman in the country who read it was like, yes, someone finally gets it. But they didn't look up the fact that this guy wrote for a socialist magazine most of the time.
What I think is hysterical about this is we talked about the protagonist in our episode. about the limelight effect was the psychologist who was the most famous for something that his piece of work that he basically worked his entire career to like justify it wasn't that great. And Hubbard's the same way. Like literally his biggest piece of work was in contrast to everything that he deeply believed.
There's so much irony in this guy's life. So Hubbard, one of the other things that he wrote a piece about the married couple on the Titanic that went down together, and the wife was offered a spot on one of the lifeboats and didn't take it, and instead decided to go down with her husband, and they died in their room. They were found in their room later. 3 years after writing that, he went on a boat trip with his wife, the RMS Lusitania, and that boat was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat. This happened in 1915, and someone on the boat who escaped later wrote about seeing Hubbard and his wife just standing on the deck, arm in arm, and passed him by and was kind of like, "Hey, are you coming?" And he was like, "Well, looks like they got us. It's worse than I thought." And then saw him and his wife proceed to go into a room and close the door behind him. And that's how they died. So, I mean, talk about irony. He literally died the exact way of that married couple on the Titanic that he had written about, and pretty much he had written about what heroes they were and how, you know, they had a glorious death. He died the exact same way, which I find that piece of this little story to be kind of fascinating.
I find it interesting that sometimes you get a narrative in your head, and the narrative gets stuck in your head, and it becomes manifest destiny, if you will. It becomes something that you live out. And what's hysterical to me, the message of Garcia has kind of become manifest destiny. It's the same thing. People bark at people having absolutely no idea what it means or why it means something or what it is. And we're going to get into that deeper as we progress through this. But it's the same thing. My wife is a linguist, and what she has taught me is when you communicate with people from different cultures or have different languages, you can't use jargon. A jargon's an abbreviation. It could be something that, you know, instead of calling something $1, we call it a buck, as an example, like the Brits call it a quid. So, but people don't know what that is in shorthand in many instances because it's jargon. Yeah. And what you kind of realize is like a message to Garcia is that it's been planted in people's heads, but in a lot of instances they don't know what it is, and we're going to define that today. But it's if you really want to not just dictate and bark at someone, you can't use jargon or just things that are predestined. You have to define it.
It's funny, Frank, as you're saying this, I can't get through an episode without using a baseball analogy. When you have 2 strikes in baseball, coaches often yell, "Shove in." What that just means is get a little closer to the plate so that the outside corner pitch doesn't beat you. Because a lot of times a kid will stand there and look at the outside corner on strike 3. So coaches yell, "Shove in." And for all of us coaches, like the last time we played was high school baseball. So we had already played another 10 years than my little guys that are 10 had played. And so for the first 2 seasons of the Muck Dogs, you would just, every time there's 2 strikes, you'd hear all of our coaches, "Shove in, shove in." You'd hear parents yelling, "Hey, shove in." You hear it on the video. And one time at practice, I said, "You guys ever hear us saying shove in?" And all the kids, nodded their head. And I said, "What does shove in mean?"
They had no idea.
They all just stared at me, looked at me, and they're like, "That means swing hard. Don't, make sure you swing at, the next pitch because it could be strike 3. And that means really load, or that means, don't get beat by the curve." None of them had any idea that meant get closer to the plate. But we hadn't stopped to think about a bunch of 8 and 9-year-olds might not understand some jargon that we had spent our life being around watching baseball and playing baseball. And it's the same with Murph saying people are yelling, "Go get a message to Garcia." And for years, he's just like, "Oh, all right, I'm going to do that." And then as he's getting ready to retire, he's like, "Oh, there's an actual essay about that? Oh shit, give me that. I want to read it."
It's kind of like confronting your high school football coach when he doesn't call you the right name. Like in a lot of instances, we just don't want to look like idiots. And because of that, we just assume we know what something means. And in many instances, we were assuming the absolute wrong thing.
Yeah. And the same thing would have happened to Murph if he would have said, "My name's not Murph." when he got yelled at for not blocking hard enough because the coach was already pissed, as would have happened if he would have said, "What do you mean clean out my locker? What does that mean?" to his drill instructor, yelled, "Get a message to Garcia." He just didn't say anything. The irony in that is hilarious. How he got his name Murph is the same kid that just went and cleaned his locker and didn't know what message to Garcia was. In both cases, he didn't question, and we'll talk about that later, in large part because high school football coaches are very similar to drill instructors. There is no question me. Even if what I said was ignorant and lacking context or instruction, don't question me. Just do what I'm saying.
And it's funny because you and I were talking offline before we hit record about what I'm dealing with a 2.5-year-old and a 1-month-old. Like it's a shit sandwich every single day at my house. It's just a carnival. And it's funny because I am willing to put up with my kid acting a certain way. 'Cause he's my kid and he's 2.5, but I would never allow him to do that to you. Like I would, you respect Mr. Matthews. Like those are things that we do. And what we teach our children is respect for others. So they question their parents, but they don't question other adults. And because they're willing to not question other adults, in some instances, shove in, you just say, okay. And you don't want to be rude and you don't want to ask for clarity because you don't want to think you're dumb, or you don't want them to think you're being, you're not following the direction. So you don't say anything. And I think that's one of the best things that like I've learned as an adult is how to just come out and say, I don't know what you mean. Now, I've never been in the military. I probably would have done terrible there. But in corporate America, one of the things that was commented to me often is Frank will ask questions. Frank isn't afraid to say he doesn't know. And because of that, I got further fast. Like, I don't know what you mean. I don't know what that term means. I'm not sure. I don't know. Now, I did all the other work, so I wasn't just showing up being a moop, but at the same time, I was showing up like with good questions. And that's the difference between the corporate world and the military. And I think what we're going to get into the broader context today is kind of the punchline of this is you need some level of guidance, and then you need some initiative. And what's the sweet spot?
Yeah, there's got to be some kind of a balance. We're in the real estate industry, and the real estate industry is just loaded with jargon and loaded with acronyms. And God, look at a mortgage, Frank. I mean, how many things? It's like its own language, right? You're talking about FHA and what's your DTI and what's your LTV, and I'm trying
pages of disclosures. It's all kinds of stuff.
It's brutal, and we had to always be very cognizant of that when we brought in new people, because if you use that, the problem is when you use a term that is insider information and you say it in a group. The reason why people don't raise their hand is because in their head, they're thinking everyone else knows what that means, but me, I'm the idiot here. So Murph didn't say, what's a message to Garcia? Because he assumed everyone else in the military knew what that meant. And he was an idiot if he was the one asking. So he should know those kind of things. And the truth is, a lot of times that's not the case. If you just say, can I stop you for a second? You said something, I didn't know anything what you were talking about. Same with my kids. They think every other of the 12 kids on this baseball team know what shove in means, but me, I'm the fool. I'm not about to raise my hand and say, what's that mean? Because now you've said it so many times to me and I've nodded my head that after it's happened a few times, there's zero chance you're going to bring it up, because now it's almost like you've been living a lie that you didn't understand for so long.
We've gone into this. You got a beautiful, I'm putting you on a spot, but I bet you'll nail it. The way that you explain the difference between a feature and a benefit. Do you remember how you've done that before?
Yeah.
Go ahead, say it.
Feature is what, and the benefit is so what.
And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about here. Is what's the difference in those two? Like, we're doing something different in our company now with the way we do our daily calls, and we're going department by department. And the departments are giving a bunch of spewing. Okay, great. People are going to gloss over, and it doesn't come out to what's the benefit? What's the so what? Why? If we're going to get more organized and have PO system, and we're going to focus on the cost per foot of our construction, what's the benefit to the people in the company? Well, the benefit is we can pay a little bit more to buy an asset. It could create a deal where there isn't a deal now. We could drive some margin. We might be able to promote somebody. There's all these little things. But if you say, we're just focused on this, people don't ask the follow-up question of why. What's the benefit? What's in it for me? And that's part of conditioning that little kids certainly don't have. But even as adults, sometimes we just nod our heads like, oh. But when you look at it, you're like, well, is that person full of shit, or is there a reason for this? Like, what are we marching into?
Yeah. So let's talk about who Garcia is, who was getting the message, and let's start with the historical accuracy of what the story is. So conflict between Spain and America, late 1800s. Cuba is getting pushed and pulled through this whole conflict. Eastern Cuba, rebel forces pushing back, U.S. Army trying to partner with them. And there was a 41-year-old first lieutenant by the name of Andrew Rowan, and he was selected by the U.S. Army to find General Garcia, the commander of the rebel forces. And so posing as a civilian, he got on a boat to Jamaica and then got some help to get connected with the Cuban revolutionaries, found a way to get ashore on a boat to get to Cuba, which was not possible for other American citizens at the time. Supposedly, it took him 8 days on horseback through the jungle without a map, through the mountains, finally finds this rebel. And obviously, a rebel commander is not going to be posting his address. If you're a rebel, they're trying to kill you. They're trying to find you. So you are hiding. So here's a U.S. civilian, a U.S. Army lieutenant posing as a civilian, riding around on a horseback through Cuba. And you think about the jungles of Cuba, you think about snakes and wild animals, and the government is looking for you. The military is looking for rebels wherever they can. No map, no idea how to find Garcia, but it was important for the U.S. to communicate with Garcia and to see what was going on the ground floor with the rebels. And so he finds Garcia. Garcia gives him a bunch of information. He gets the intel that he needs. And he was supposed to stay with Garcia and kind of communicate of what was going on the ground floor. And here's where it kind of breaks a little bit from the message. But what ended up happening is Garcia and Rowan both wanted to get some publicity out of this. So he only stayed with him a little while, and it took another 5-day horseback journey out, back up through the north this time, found a little boat, got off, got on a steamer, made their way back to Florida. And then Rowan became kind of a bit of a celebrity in America. And really what he did was break orders, which is wild. So this whole story of a message to Garcia of this guy who just took orders and did what he was told, Rowan actually totally broke orders, was supposed to stay with Garcia, instead risked the entire mission to get off the island, get back and break the news to the newspapers in America about what a hero he was, that he had done all of these things. So what I find absolutely more irony of this whole thing, the message to Garcia, the myth of it is do what you're told, find a way to get it done, don't ask for questions. And a lot of it is that's what he did, because he didn't have a map. He couldn't communicate with the U.S. government. He couldn't communicate with the army. He just had a horse and he had to go find Garcia. So that's the fascinating part of this. And what became of it is it's a fable of doing what you're told, following the chain of command, not asking questions, putting the mission before yourself. But what's beautiful is it's left out the second part of the story. As soon as he finished the mission, he broke all of his orders, self-promoted, broke it to the newspapers, and it would have got him court-martialed. But the problem is the papers had already released it. And in the American public's view, Rowan was a hero. Like, it got out and the Associated Press made this huge deal about it, where he kind of became this Buffalo Bill, figure, and they had no choice but to promote him and make an even bigger deal of this guy, Rowan. That's the facts of the story.
So often it's the sizzle and it's not the steak, right? And what you remember long term can often change. And But I want to kind of have some fun with this. The most powerful person in the free world in 1899 took 2 weeks to get correspondence to and from a critical person in a war. Like nowadays, we can do that in seconds, and it's probably a little garbled, or there's a little bit of fuzz, or there's a bad cell connection, and we bitch about the fact that it's not perfect conditions, but it took 2 weeks back then. So it just shows you how disconnected the world was, and how much, like, even in this, in those times, you really had to do things. There was 2 weeks between correspondences. So I thought that was really interesting. We got this from Murph. I reached out to Murph. I got some really cool things from him on kind of takeaways, but I think this is kind of what we should come into. There's 2 major takeaways when someone in the military hears there's take the message to Garcia. The first one is take care of what you have to take care of and hide the bodies. Like is that what we're dealing with? Like, basically use the nuclear option. I don't care. Get it done. Bury everything else. The other side of it is, if it comes up, it's like, okay, this is not a moment for mentorship. That was a direct quote, which I love. Like, this is a moment of, I'm going to give you direct action. You take it and go do it. In reality, nobody followed these rules, and it's kind of like a fable or kind of a parable from the Bible. Who knows what the truth is, but what was written down became something else and took on a life of its own, and now it's a lesson. But those are 2 of the major kind of takeaways of, do I scorch earth and just say, screw it? And think about that in business. Am I willing to throw anything at this problem just to get this piece of results? Or do I have to rally the troops and just kind of pull people along and do our best, but at the same time, not break all the rules?
So this all comes out in the Associated Press. He becomes a hero. Rowan becomes a hero. And Hubbard published his essay in the March 1899 issue of the Philistine. And it went about as viral.
Which is an awesome name of a publication, by the way.
Beautiful, beautiful magazine. And it went as viral as things could go back in 1899. And it became a rallying cry for corporate executives. And I think if you've not read it, just Google PDF message to Garcia. It's 2.5 pages. I find it to be compelling writing. And the reason why it's compelling, good writers write as if they know their readers, and the reader that he's clearly trying to get to is a business owner, a manager, a corporate executive, a coach, a military lieutenant, a leader of some kind in the military. It resonates with anyone who's led people and at least had one lazy bastard who reported to you. Right, Frank? And everyone always has one at the time who is just not listening to you and you're frustrated with, and this resonates with anyone who's ever had that.
The way I would say his audience is anybody who relies on the achievements of others to accomplish.
Yes,
so
great.
All the things that you just said a second ago, but that is who this message is. So if you're a doer and you're a maker, you build something, this probably doesn't resonate. But if you work outside of yourself and achieve through others, this message is written for you.
Yep. So Frank, I'm just going to go ahead and read some of the kind of juicy parts of the memo. I'm not going to read the whole memo, but I'll read you some bullets, direct quotes. So McKinley gave Rowan a letter to be delivered to Garcia. Rowan took the letter and did not ask, where is he at? By the eternal, there is a man whose form should be cast in deathless bronze and the statue placed in every college in the land. This hyperbole is just unbelievable in this, by the way. By the eternal is something that you and I should say more, and ye gads. I think we should say that also.
We need to bring that back. But you can think the guy was 41 writing this. Like, it feels like he had like a staff or a cane and he's just screaming it.
Oh, just grumpy. It is not book learning that young men need, nor instruction about this or that, but a stiffening of the vertebrae, which will cause them to be loyal to a trust, to act promptly, concentrate their energies, do the thing, carry a message to Garcia. He goes on to say,
let's have some fun with that. We talked about the similarities between people in the military and football coaches. your football coach has said to you, stiffen the vertebrae. Basically, get a sack up is another one they would have used in the 90s.
Get a pair of balls. That's what a football coach says.
And that's it. And it's just like, in stiffen of the vertebrae is be tough. Like, get in there and pop your head in there. That's what they're saying. And that's, I mean, in 1899, it was a lot less delicate of a world.
Hubbard goes on to describe the state of the American worker. Slipshod assistance, foolish inattention, dowdy indifference, and half-hearted work seem the rule. What a beautiful way with words of describing lazy bastards.
I need to give this a sack. There's absolutely no way he's listening to our podcast, but I need to mail him this letter.
Mail him the letter. This sounds like Jim Sack. There's no doubt.
I'll send it to him via carrier pigeon.
This is an attorney that Frank and I both use. So you reader, put this matter to a test. You are sitting now in your office. 6 clerks are within your call. Summon anyone and make this request. Please look in the encyclopedia and make a brief memo for me concerning the life of Correggio. Will the clerk quietly say, yes, sir, and go do the task? On your life, he will not. He will look at you out of a fishy eye and ask one or more of the following. Fishy eye is amazing. And ask one or more of the following questions. Who was he? Which encyclopedia? Where is the encyclopedia? Was I hired for that? Don't you mean Bismarck? What's the matter with Charlie doing it? Is he dead? Is there any hurry? What do you want to know for? And I think this.
You left out the best one. Shan't I bring you the book and let you look it up yourself?
Shan't.
Shan't.
Shan't sounds an awful lot like shat, which makes me laugh more than shan't.
Highbrow on this podcast. Highbrow.
Yeah. So this is Hubbard's way of saying this is how most people are responding today. No one just does what they're asked to do for an honest living. And then he goes on to say how valuable the person is who will just get a message to Garcia. Self-interest prompts every employer to keep the best, those who can carry a message to Garcia. My heart goes out to the man who does his work when the boss is away, as well as when he is home. And the man, when given a letter for Garcia, quietly takes the missive without asking any idiotic questions. Civilization is one long, anxious search for just such individuals. Anything such a man asks will be granted. His kind is so rare that no employer can afford to let him go. The world cries out for such. He is needed and needed badly. The man who can carry a message to Garcia. So that is our Cliff Notes version of a 2.5-page memo that has become shorthand for just do the damn job in the military and in certain aspects of corporate culture.
So let's get into this a little bit, Ian. Like, when you read that out loud, and what do you think of? Like, who are those people? Like, is it everybody in an organization? Is it certain people? Like, I think of it very specifically, but I'll ask you first. Like, who is that person in the organization?
God, they're normally the person that I want to promote. They're normally the person that is. There's a quote that I just always love, which is, if you want something done right, give it to the busiest person in the office. I love that quote because I've always felt like I was the busiest person in the office, but I could always handle one more thing if asked. And it also makes me think of the line of, you interview every day for the next job, and by the time someone gets promoted, they've already been doing the job for a while. But when I hear that, I think there's very few people that are just like this, that are just they're on a regular basis, they do something that just pleasantly surprises you. Like, oh, you go to tell them to do something, and they're like, oh, I did that a couple of weeks ago. I'm way ahead of that. I've already, you want to see what I put? I built a spreadsheet for that. I already have a tool that I've been using, kind of quietly under the table. They're just ahead of you most of the time. The other thing I think about is they're worth their weight in gold. They're the worst person you could possibly lose in your organization because they're thinking ahead of you most of the time.
So there's two different people that I see that embody this role. Now, I've worked in my organization's mid to high 30s at this point from an employee count. So we've got different people who play this role in different departments. There's a few people who play this role across the company that you can kind of give a bunch of different tasks to. But to Ian's point, there's usually a riser. There's a young person who's in the organization who's just reliable inside of their job, and they're going to get promoted. And that's awesome. Like Ian and I have embodied that at different points in our lives. We've gotten promoted. People embody that in my company, they get promoted. But then there's also the person who you might not think of that's like this as well. Like we had a production manager at Ryan Homes. I haven't talked to him in a decade, but he was in that role for like 13 or 14 years when he worked with me when I was running a division. And he was just a reliable person. He was great at doing that job. And he, as long as he wanted that job, would have it because he would just get stuff done. Instead of like having a huge upward arc, this person was very happy in the role they were in. They were incredibly reliable. They could get things done. They could also mentor. They could teach. They could coach. But if push came to shove, you knew you could call this person and they would get it done. So I think depending on where you are in your career, like if you are a career person and you're thinking like, I just want a job and I want to be here. If you have a skill set where you can be called upon and you deliver always, you will always be employed. If you are someone who really wants to be promoted, if you have that same skill set inside of your lane and you're great at something, you will find yourself getting promoted because you are so relied upon there. To Ian's point, the busiest person are people who just have more capacity. So that's what I've always seen.
When I started with GE, it was a 2-year leadership program, Frank, and there were 4 6-month rotations you were supposed to go on. So I was supposed to be in a different city. I would move cities every time. So talk about corporate excess. I mean, it's a lot of money. I don't think we do that today in a world of COVID and everything else. But it was going to be like Atlanta, Houston, Pittsburgh, Chicago, 4 different 6-month stops, and for the most part, most of these stops were shadowing. They weren't even productive sessions. It was like a 2-year MBA of just being around the business. And if you're around the business, you obviously are going to learn. And I just thought that was ridiculous. I thought there's like, I spent a month and a half where I probably visited with 30 salespeople around the country. I had an unlimited budget to fly wherever I want and just go see customers. And I remember thinking, I can't do this for 2 years. I can't just sit and watch for 2 years other people sell. And so I came back to Atlanta after, visiting so many people. And I talked to one of the local sales reps and I said, do you have a list of customers you're not calling on that you wish you were? And he's like, yeah, of course. There's always people I wish I was getting to. I'm like, would you mind if I called on them? And I'll give you credit for any of it. I'm not on commission. He's like, sure. And he gave me this like binder, this book. And I just started calling on people. This is like 2 months into working for the company. And my boss had no idea I was doing it, but I would do it when I had free time. And I started getting the local sales guy appointments. And then he started getting some orders out of it. And then just one day, like 5 months later, when I was getting ready for the end of my rotation, that sales rep went to the manager and said, how do we keep him in Atlanta? And he was like, well, it doesn't work that way. He's got to, next he's going to Indiana, Chicago. That's part of his rotation. They're like, we don't want to lose him. He's really helped us build up a customer base of new customers. And my manager was like, what are you talking about? He goes, do you know how many customers Ian's got us into? Do you know how many customers he calls a week? And my manager had no idea I was doing any of this because I was doing it to practice for myself. And part of me felt like I was a waste of money, like I wasn't productive, but I was just cold calling. And it was the best because, Frank, I had nothing to lose. No one knew I was doing it. So the first 100 that said go to hell or didn't call back, it was like, well, no one knows I'm doing this. I'm not on commission. But that's an example of getting a message to Garcia. I was just doing something without being told to do it that was productive, that could help my manager's team. And I remember he was just so blown away by it, and he was so appreciative that I was out there doing it that it made a name for myself as someone with initiative, because the other 20 kids on the leadership program just shadowed. That's all they did. They did what they were told, and nothing more, nothing additional.
So let's talk about this, because I think most of the people who are listening to this podcast are either managers or they're business owners. So how do you find people? Like, you want people like this on your team. You want people who take initiative. Ian's story is the essence of what the message to Garcia is all about. It's someone who doesn't need to do something that feels the need to do it because they're just compelled. My internship story, I thought the coolest thing about it is when I left to go back to college, they replaced me with 2 people. Like, I felt pretty good about that. I used that in job interviews and told people, like, they're like, are you any good at this? I'm like, I don't know. But when I went back to college, they replaced me with 2 people. They're like, So, like, how do you promote yourself in an interview and show those things? Or how do you get a story out of somebody that shows the essence of this person will just roll up their sleeves and do what it takes? And that's what I heard in your story, Ian. And I think it's so important to find that with people that come to work for me or in an organization. It's like, you want to build your lineup. You want to have the Garcia guy, his name comes up a lot, but it's Rowan who's the hero of the story. You got to find the Rowans. How do you find someone that goes and does it? And you have to also realize when it's time for Rowan to get a new opportunity. If Rowan's been doing the same thing over and over and over and getting tired of constantly pulling miracles out of their rear end, it might be time for something new and fresh where they can be challenged in a different way. And that's up to you as a manager and a leader. But finding those kind of people is critical. Unearthing those stories is critical, and then giving them the ability and the runway to really flourish.
So a number of things, you kind of asked that in a question, Frank, so I'll try to answer it a little bit. From a perspective of hiring and finding, and it's the same as if you are trying to promote yourself in finding a job. I like to find people. Tell me about something you've created. So it might be a side gig that you started for yourself. It might be a side business that you did, even if it didn't make a lot of money, but you started something locally. You started a school newspaper that didn't exist before you came along, or a website or a blog, or you found a way to make money on eBay. I love stories about people that worked for like small business owners who trusted them with the shop. So I'm thinking of a kid we hired in Richmond who worked for a small business owner who owned a tool shop. Like he had like a tool shop and a garden equipment kind of a place. But over time, he grew to trusting this high school kid to open the shop, close it at night. He would take week-long vacations and trust him to run the shop while he was gone. To me, that's message to Garcia. If I feel so comfortable with you as a high school kid where I can go take a vacation with my wife and you're running the shop and making all the decisions while I'm gone, that's customer rebates, that's customers frustrated, that's calling to get a warranty issue fixed, getting the stock shelved. That's not calling me 40 times a day. And he ended up being an incredible hire, and he was just like that when he came to work for us. He was a message to Garcia kind of kid. All of those things for me were, when did you have a boss who literally trusted you and gave you full autonomy to run the business in certain areas of the business, even if it was a landscaping business or something, Frank, where he just gave you a certain segment of his customer base? I think those are all areas where, if you're looking to hire, look for stories like that, where you took initiative, you took something on, you owned something. Tell me about a time where you created something in your company and you weren't asked to do it and you had no direction. Tell me about, that you might come up and say, you know what, I told my boss we need some interns, and I created an internship program, and I went and hired them, and I led them, and I put the program together, and it's still around today. Those are things I look for as a hiring manager. And those are things that, if you're trying to find a better career, that you should highlight if you've done some of those things.
So, as I agreed completely, as an interviewer, how I can do it or you can do it, but like, how do you get people to tell you these things? Because there's certain people who are going to volunteer them, and there's certain people who just don't know in an interview they should. So like, I've got a couple of methods where I like drive at it, but how do you drive those stories out of people if they're not volunteering them?
Tell me something that your manager trusted you with that he didn't trust the rest of the team with. I love that. So take your Outback Steakhouse experience. I will guarantee you that the manager of your restaurants gave you much more rope to go do things and make decisions after working with you for a few summers than he did on your first week.
For sure.
True?
Yeah.
So even that, you were a great employee at Outback, and we have to talk about Outback in every episode, but you were trusted even as a kid to do some things that the other kids weren't trusted to do. It might have been, I don't know what it would have been. It might have been inventory. It might have been with finances. It might have been with locking, closing the doors, trusting. Like, there were certain things that you were given responsibility. So I like to ask questions of, tell me about responsibilities you had that your peers were not given the same responsibility or the same trust. And if you can't answer that, you're probably not a person that gets a message to Garcia. If you can't answer that in any place you ever worked.
So I'll ask for, where did you find yourself with opportunity or with chances or being entrusted with things that others in your role weren't? It's like back to Outback, like we were given the keys early in the morning at 16 years old. Like that wasn't normal. We were asked to do things after hours to help the store, which wasn't normal. Like we were very easily given responsibilities. If I think of myself in the role like of the project manager and a costing manager, I didn't do much costing. I did a ton of college recruiting. And they knew I was good at that. They gave me like 3 or 4 things that I would work on until like 10, 11, 12 at night. Sometimes I would get those things done. And then I would go hit the road or do it from the hotel room at the college campuses. So like those are little things, but what you want to pull out of someone sitting in front of you is, where were they distinguished? Where did they have opportunity? Where did someone lean on them? Where did you act older than you actually are? And you can pull these stories from 100 places. My wife is an awesome example of this. Her sister was going off to college and was incredibly nervous and had her mom with her. The same weekend, my wife went to New York City, flew there, took a subway, and basically just had an address and did it alone. Like that's someone that you could basically say, go figure this out. And she figured it out. And like, that's the stuff that could you get a couple of stories out of people like that? And then once you know that you think you've got this in somebody, when do you demonstrate, okay, I do trust you, go handle this? That's kind of the arc.
There was, I think also, tell me about something that was broken that your manager asked you to fix with little direction. Yeah. That's a great question to ask. I think about myself at NVR for about 5 years. Almost every year I was given a new office that was broken, almost every single year. And it got to be a running joke where I would just say to my manager, are you just going to keep complaining about this office, or you want me to get down there and fix it? And that's how it would always, after so much complaining, he would complain. I would say, do you want me to go down to Charlotte and fix it? Or do you want to just keep complaining to me? And he wouldn't get in my hair. He would say, just go fix it. And whatever resources you need, I'm sure you'll make good decisions. And then once that was fixed, it was like, you're going to go fix Florida? Okay, I'll go fix Florida. What about Baltimore? Can you fix Baltimore? And you have to be able to articulate that, right? To where you've just gotten to a place with your manager where your manager says, please go fix. Please go.
So let's pivot this to the other side of the equation. Let's say you are a manager and you have someone with you that is capable of doing these things. You must give them opportunity to do it over and over again, or they will get bored and they will quit. 100%. And it's easier to manage someone who doesn't have this skill set, frankly. It's easier to keep them under your thumb and to keep managing them and keep following up. But if you've got someone who really takes the reins and runs with them, you need to continue to give that person opportunity. And you have to be very mindful of, how do I not allow this person to get stale or stagnant? How do I give this person more opportunity? How do I give them more rope? How do I continue to entice them and engage them? And that I think that's kind of like the PhD level of management, is you realize these are the group of people currently who need a lot of management. This is the person who needs less, and I need to manage each group differently.
God, Frank, it's fascinating you're talking about this because I'm thinking about myself as you're talking. So I just explained that I kept getting
a normal occurrence.
Always. So I kept getting a new office, but by the time at the end of NVR when I left, there were no more offices to give me. Every office.
You're bored.
They all reported to me. And
you solved it.
Regionals under me, it was like solved. I got good regionals. They're handling it. I got good offices. There were literally no more offices to give me. And I was bored out of I'm just hanging around here to collect big paychecks and I'm not interested. So that point you just mentioned, if you have someone who's good at fixing things, you have to keep giving them new things to go solve, or they will quickly especially if it's all Pavlov dog too for me. I had gotten used to every year, something new, some new challenge. And then all of a sudden, nothing new. There's nothing broken for me to just keep going and fixing. And that was my time to leave. That's the way that worked. And
that's right.
So the pros of this, when you read it, if you're taking away the good in it and you get cut through the sarcasm, what Hubbard's talking about is you want to be a resourceful person. You want to be an autonomous person. You don't want to burden your manager with a bunch of meaningless questions or questions that you could go find on your own with a Google search or by reading the actual policies already in place or talking to someone underneath your manager who maybe is closer to it. You want people with an unwavering commitment, to the mission. I have another story that I used to tell on this. Florida was a broken office that I had to get involved in. And on top of it, as soon as I got involved, we lost like 2 of our 4 salespeople. So our 4 weren't good and 2 left. And one of them I had to fire because he was signing loan applications for customers. He was committing fraud. So I had to go down there and fire him. And he had the biggest pipeline of customers. So I came back and we had a loan officer in Richmond who was super talented and not that busy. So it was, perfect example. And she had told us before that she wanted to go to Florida one day. She wanted to move there with her husband. Came down, I got on the phone with her. I said, look, I need help. I need you to go to Florida. I need you to fix it. I need you to, clear everything up that you can. And I need you to do it without me being there because I'm also managing a whole bunch of other offices. I'm not going to be able to give you a lot of direction. Go down there, get involved, fix it. And that's what she did. She went down there. I would check in with her like once a week. I knew she was going through this shit. I knew it was terrible for her. And she wouldn't burden me with that. I would talk to her, I'd be like, you okay? She'd be like, oh, it's a lot. But she took on like 100 customers. She had to make the divisions happier. 6 months later, she got me a bridge to where we hired 3-4 more salespeople. We had process in place. She won them over. She came back to Richmond. We promoted her like a month later in Richmond to a management job. But I always talked about that with her of she was that person that took very little, needed little guidance. She knew me well. She knew what I wanted to get done there, but she didn't need me to hold her hand the whole time.
On the opposite end of that spectrum, my sister bought a Ryan home while Ian was still in charge of the mortgage. And she called me up very frustrated. And she's like, my loan officer hasn't called me back. I don't know what to do. I don't want to disappoint Ian. I don't want him to see that I'm going outside. Like, how do I handle this?
Oh.
And I waited until Ian had had a couple of cocktails. And
you waited until I flew out to California to hang out with you to tell me this.
And then it was like 11 o'clock at night Eastern time. Ian stepped away, and a friend of mine and I both looked at my sister like, I feel like that loan's going to take care of itself.
She got like a daily update on what was going on after that.
She got a pretty good rate. Yeah. But so having people like that is it's critical in your business, and it's also important to feed it. You need to realize that. And in a bigger culture or a bigger company like Ian with MVR, Ian had the autonomy to be able to move someone to a different market. You get to test them out, see if they're any good, give them an opportunity. It feels like kind of like a quasi promotion without it. In a small business, I'm dealing with this right now. I'm rewriting someone's role. Like I'm rewriting what the role is because the person's done the jobs, and they're rowing. So I have to, if I don't want to lose them, I've got to think through, how do I set this up where I can keep a talented person engaged and continue to give them challenges and not burden them with some of this other stuff. And that comes down to being a good leader. So I would challenge you, dear listener, if you have someone who works for you who you're afraid you're going to lose, figure out how not to. Figure out how to utilize their skills, how to challenge them, how to empower them, how to give them these things. Because Ian, you were out of rope at NVR. I was ready to go. Like we were both there. But if there was some other job where there was hurdles and challenges, and if they would have given that to you maybe a year and a half earlier, where, hey, we're going to utilize your skill set, we're going to keep it fresh, we're going to give you something new, you might not have checked out. You may have had an ability to say, you know what, I would really like to try this challenge. You might have still, but the chances are more likely you wouldn't have.
Yeah. And if you have a Rowan, understand that a Rowan needs to feel ownership, and a Rowan needs to put their stamp on something. They need autonomy. They don't need you over them telling them how to do something. They just need to know your what do you want? What do you want to accomplish? And they need to be able to feel creative. Someone who gets a message to Garcia, the reason they're not coming back to you, another reason, is because they're confident in themselves and they don't think your way is the best way. They believe in themselves enough to go through it. There are some cons, I think, of this message as well. Obviously, it's sarcastic. It's funny. I would always talk with millennials about this, and a lot of them would be put off by some of the language, the way it was talked about. And it was written in 1899, so obviously it's going to be written in a condescending approach. But there's risks to people who just blindly accept a mission without asking any questions. I certainly didn't like someone working for me that if they didn't believe in what I asked them to do, wouldn't stop and say, I've got some questions to ask here. I think there's some unintended consequences, Ian, that you're not thinking about of what you're asking me to do. By all means, I want someone to do that. And the message to Garcia can be construed as, don't ever ask questions. Leadership is always right. You're always wrong. That's a little bit of the military mindset that Murph, shared at the beginning of this episode of just, some people just wanted to be heard and didn't care what was right. So I think when you say that the mission is all that matters and completing it is all that matters without thinking about unintended consequences and pushing back a little bit, it can be dangerous on an organization, because that's when you get into group think, and group think is miserable on an organization.
I don't think that this works blindly in the 21st century or in corporate America or in the private sector. I think in the military, it still works. In communist Russia or communist China, probably still works, or socialist, now they're calling themselves. But the moral of the story is, like, with hierarchy and demand and managing people in a way that you do not want them to think, it works. But what you want is, you want to teach. Here's the best thing you can possibly do with an employee. Give them very clear directives. Here's what your job description is. Here's what I expect. I'm going to train you, show you what to do. And then if you display confidence or competence, I'm going to let you do it. And then that person takes it further and does things that anticipate your needs. That is the dream sequence.
Yeah. And I think even in the military, military wants adaptive, agile leaders.
Sure.
They like people that can, you think about this, I can see why this would resonate. You've got someone in Afghanistan, you're cut off on communications. You need people that can just get something done, do it. But I think the military also wants you to push back and say, is this really the mission we should be doing? Should we be going to this house? Do we need to be in that hot spot? Because that saves lives, pushing back. A commander who's in some command post in America and is not there telling you to do something, is not boots on the ground, they might not understand that this could get a bunch of people killed. So I think the military would want someone who pushes back a little bit and says, you might not have all the information. Let me share something. Is this really what we should be doing? And I think it's the same in business. I know I never want to be the emperor with no clothes that no one's telling me. No one's telling me this is a dumb idea, and I'm sure you're probably the same way as well.
For sure. And I mean, I would like to think I'm open-minded and can listen to these things. And yeah, exactly. It's on the con side, I would just think you got to be careful to expect people to march blindly or act blindly and just march forward yourself. Like it's not 21st century thinking. It isn't sustainable in today's market. It took 14 days to get a message there. We could send a text message and you have it in 40 seconds now. So like it's a little bit different, but the theme is this. The other thing I'll kind of close with as we get into this is this became required reading for Ian and me both. And then we had people who work with us read it. And there was a period in my life where I was kind of pissed off and had the right people working here. And I left. I was angry about something not getting done. And I left the message to Garcia. I left a bunch of them on like in an area that was kind of public. And this is before Corona, people come in the office all the time. And it just sat there and nobody picked it up. I mentioned it, but nobody really picked it up and read it. And then I ended up getting into a conversation with somebody who was supposed to help kind of steer the group and kind of set the tone. And this person doesn't work here anymore. And I was like, I love that article. I love the message of just go get it done. And her reply to me was, yeah, I could see you liking that. But my name's on the door and I got to pick who gets to be on the seats and who doesn't. And I like people who hold others accountable to that. I like the theme of that. I like to know that the lowest person on the totem pole can be relied on, just like the people at the top. And I feel like if you have an organization that's built that way, you have people that don't let each other down and you build a real team and a culture.
That's a fantastic wrap up. I'm very proud of you for that wrap.
Thanks, Ian. Are you proud of me that I didn't have to pee? I didn't have to pee this episode either.
Oh, it's pretty incredible. That's and thank you to Murph. This was your episode, homie.
Oh, it was so fun to talk to him about this and get prepped. So fun stuff. He had all kinds of parenting nuggets that maybe we'll use at another point in time.
I feel like Murph should make a regular stop on this podcast. I think our listeners would enjoy a regular stop in from the old Murph.
One of the lines that I wanted to get in here that I was remiss in doing is from Michael Clayton. It's like there's a scene where he's like, "You have a niche. You have a niche." Like that's the kind of guy who like fits in with Rowan. So
beautiful.
All right,
beautiful
Ian.
Thing. Hey, way to get a message to Garcia today, Frankie.
I feel like we did a good job here.
We delivered
Let's not spend too much time
not on horseback, but we made it happen.
That's right.
See you, buddy.
See ya.